high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where you have my guarantee the host will not be defeated by the teleprompter this week. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the Last Radius. Glad to have you with us tonight. And coming up for your kind consideration on This Week in History, we have got, well, among other things, ancient Rome, medieval geopolitics, linguistic, colonial America, the Civil War, naval history, art, crime, astronomy, nuclear physics, aviation, spaceflight, literature, monarchy, and 3 different examples of human beings discovering an ingenious new technology and almost immediately finding a dangerously self-destructive use for it. So, without any further dithering and prevarication, let's light this candle, or get this show on the road, or start this here shooting match, or whatever metaphor tickles your naughty bits. We begin August 17th, 1807. Robert Fulton makes the steamboat that can actually make money. On Monday, the 17th of August, 1807, Robert Fulton left New York City aboard the vessel usually remembered as the Claremont, although contemporary advertisements called her rather less romantically the North River Steamboat, bound on the Hudson River up for Albany. Fulton was not the first man to build a steamboat, despite what generations of school books may have often implied. People had been experimenting with steam propulsion for decades at that point, generally producing craft that demonstrated the principle quite admirably before demonstrating the bankruptcy laws even more conclusively. What Fulton and his financial backer Robert Livingston managed was the truly important bit, that is, a steamboat that was practical and reliable enough that it could viably support a commercial enterprise. Fulton reached Livingston's estate at Claremont after 24 hours and Albany after 32 hours underway, covering 150 miles at just under 5 miles per hour. That sounds rather unimpressive until you remember that the wind was against him the entire way. Traditionally, sailing vessels on the Hudson were dependent upon whichever direction nature had chosen to blow on that particular morning. But Fulton, he could simply light a fire in a boiler and tell nature to go get stuffed. Within weeks, the boat was advertising regular passenger service between New York and Albany. And there, more so than in the novelty of steam propulsion itself, lay the revolution. For essentially all of previous human history up to that point, water transportation had depended upon muscle or current or wind or a fortuitous combination of all of the above. But now, you could leave on something resembling a schedule and arrive reasonably close to when you said you would. The Industrial Revolution, in other words, had finally invented the timetable. And having recently spent several days dealing with modern air travel, I think perhaps we should apologize to Mr. Fulton for what we have managed to do with it since. 1943, Schweinfurt-Regensburg demonstrates why bombers need their little friends. On Tuesday, the 17th of August, 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force sent 376 B-17 Flying Fortresses deep into Germany against 2 of the most important industrial targets inside the Third Reich. One force would hit the Messerschmitt fighter works at Regensburg, while another would attack the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt. The clever part of the plan was that the 2 forces were supposed to go in almost simultaneously, thus dividing the Luftwaffe's attention, while the Regensburg bombers would continue south afterward and land safely in North Africa. But then the English fog intervened, as it has a tendency to do. The Regensburg force departed on schedule, while Schweinfurt was delayed long enough for the Germans to attack the first wave, then land, refuel, rearm, and then go back upstairs to attack the second one. Worse yet, the American fighters escorting the bombers simply did not possess the range to accompany them all the way into Germany. Eventually, those P-47s reached their outbound limit and had to turn around. And then several hundred B-17 crews discovered the shortcomings of the pre-war theory that said that formations of heavy bombers, if you festooned them with a sufficient number of 50 caliber machine guns, they could simply fight their own way through enemy airspace. But in the actual event, 60 flying fortresses were shot down, roughly 1 out of every 6 that were dispatched. More than 600 American airmen were killed, missing, or captured. The targets were very badly damaged, but the arithmetic was, to put it mildly, unsustainable. The lesson apparently required a refresher course, though, because on 14 October, the 8th Air Force went back to Schweinfurt and lost another goddamn 60 bombers, after which deep penetrations beyond effective fighter range were wisely and prudently curtailed. The solution was not that Schweinfurt somehow caused the invention of the P-51 Mustang. That aircraft type already existed, at least in its original configuration. The solution was that Schweinfurt demonstrated exactly what sort of airplane the bomber offensive desperately required, specifically an American P-51 Mustang outfitted with a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Beginning late in 1943, Merlin-powered P-51s with external fuel tanks started arriving in Europe, capable of accompanying the bombers deep into Germany and eventually all the way to Berlin. By the months preceding D-Day, the bombers no longer had to cross most of Germany all by themselves. The Mustang is remembered as one of history's great fighter aircraft because it was fast, agile, and handsome. And the rather esoteric idea of sticking a Spitfire's engine in the thing had much to do with that. Except for the handsome part. It was already pretty damned handsome. But one of its most important virtues was much less glamorous and far more practical. It had enough gas to stay with the people who needed it. 1945, Animal Farm is finally published. On Friday, the 17th of August, 1945, Secker and Warburg published at long last George Orwell's Animal Farm. Orwell had finished the book the previous year, but discovering a British publisher willing to print an allegory in which the Soviet Union was represented as a farm run by murderous lying pigs proved unexpectedly difficult, while Joseph Stalin was still appearing on Allied propaganda posters as good old Uncle Joe. 4 publishers turned it down. The difficulty was political rather than commercial. Wartime Britain was understandably reluctant to antagonize the country that was currently absorbing most of the confined fury of the German armed forces. Orwell himself was a democratic socialist, back when that term had an actual coherent meaning attached to it, which is an important distinction whenever anybody tries to turn Animal Farm into a generic tract for one modern political fashion or another. His target was very specific. After his experience in the Spanish Civil War, Orwell wrote that destroying what he called the Soviet myth was essential if socialism itself, that is, the brand of socialism that Orwell himself favored, was ever to recover from Stalinism. Hence, Napoleon is Stalin, Snowball is Trotsky, the dogs are the secret police, Boxer is the loyal working class, and the revolution gradually becomes indistinguishable from the tyranny it supposedly overthrew. It has therefore survived 81 years as one of the clearest political allegories that was ever written, which naturally meant that in 2026, somebody decided it needed fixing. Andy Serkis's new animated adaptation updates Mr. Pilkington into a Musk-flavored technology billionaire and adds shopping malls, drones, robots, and conspicuous consumption imagery, shifting much of the emphasis toward a more generic 21st century indictment of capitalism. It also substantially softens Orwell's famously merciless conclusion. The experiment, well, it's gone rather magnificently, hasn't it? At present, the film has a 30% critics score on Rotten Tomatoes, while even sympathetic reviewers have struggled to explain why somebody would take one of the most precisely constructed political fables in the English language and improve it by changing what it's about. The problem isn't that criticism of capitalism would have horrified Orwell, because it totally wouldn't have. The problem is that adapting Animal Farm while swapping out its specific political anatomy for whatever happens to be fashionable in 2026 is rather like adapting Moby Dick but deciding that whales are dated and making it about cryptocurrency instead. Some books are more equal than others, after all, and some adaptations probably should have remained inside the barn. August 18th, 1492, Antonio de Nebrija writes the instruction manual for an empire. On Thursday, the 18th of August, 1492, Antonio de Nebrija's Gramática Castellana was published at Salamanca. It was the first printed grammar ever devoted to Castilian Spanish, and effectively one of the foundational documents in the transformation of a regional vernacular into the language of a world empire. The timing was almost indecently perfect. A mere 15 days earlier, Christopher Columbus had sailed from Palos de la Frontera on the voyage that would connect Spain permanently with the Americas. And in the prologue to his grammar book dedicated to Queen Isabella, Nebrija supplied one of history's most prophetic observations when he said, quote, "Language was always the companion of empire. You see, Senor Nebrija understood that conquest was not merely a question of armies and borders. Once a kingdom acquired peoples who spoke different languages, it would naturally follow that government, law, religion, and administration would duly adopt the conqueror's tongue." Nebrija was thinking primarily about Spain's newly consolidated monarchy and its existing conquest at the time. He could hardly have known that the ships already sailing westward were about to do to the scale of his argument. Within a few generations, Castilian had crossed an ocean. Within a few centuries, It stretched from California to Tierra del Fuego. And 500 years later, Nebrija's thesis has undergone what scientists would call fairly extensive real-world experimental confirmation. Just look at a linguistic map of the Western Hemisphere today. The overwhelming majority of its inhabitants conduct their public lives in Spanish, English, Portuguese, or French, not coincidentally, languages imported by the four main European colonial powers of the 16th and 17th centuries. The empires, they have mostly vanished. The flags came down, their governors went home, their borders were duly redrawn, and hundreds of millions of people continued speaking their languages. As imperial afterlives go, that's a record that's rather difficult to beat, really. The British Empire managed to lose the United States and somehow still got Americans to spend the next 2.5 centuries arguing about the correct usage of the apostrophe and scoffing at the notion that the word color has a U in it. 1590, John White returns to the Lost Colony of Roanoke. On Saturday, the 18th of August, 1590, Governor John White finally returned to Roanoke Island in present-day North Carolina. He had left the colony nearly 3 years earlier to go and obtain supplies in England, which is the sort of way that colonial supply runs worked back in those days. You guys sit tight, I'm going to run to the store and get what we need, and I'll be back in a couple years, at best. Unfortunately, England then became preoccupied with the small matter of the Spanish Armada, and virtually every seaworthy vessel was thus required for national defense. And so the colonists waited. And they waited. And they waited. They waited some more. When White finally landed back at Roanoke on 18 August, the date carried an especially cruel significance, for it was the 3rd birthday of his granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the very first English child born in the colony and in North America more broadly. But White found nobody. The houses had all been dismantled. A new palisade had been erected. On a tree were carved the letters C-R-O. And on one of the palisade posts was the word that has launched 4 centuries of books, documentaries, dumb conspiracy theories, and even dumber History Channel programming. Croatoan. But here is the detail that generally gets lost when the story is presented as some sort of insoluble supernatural mystery. To John White, Croatoan absolutely was not any sort of mysterious message. It was really more of a forwarding address, because before leaving, he had specifically instructed the colonists to carve the name of their destination if they should happen to relocate. If they had been forced to leave under attack or some sort of distress, they were supposed to add a Maltese cross. There was no cross. However, Croatoan was an island, the island that we now call Hatteras Island, in fact, and home to native people with whom the colonists had established relations. White therefore concluded that his people had moved there and immediately tried to go and look for them. And then, unfortunately, a storm prevented him from reaching Croatoan and forced his ship back out to sea. Alas, he never returned. So the great mystery of Roanoke is not really that 100+ human beings disappeared into thin air, leaving behind one incomprehensible word. They disappeared, leaving behind a sign telling rescuers exactly where they had probably gone. History simply never managed to go and check the address, which is somehow all the much more frustrating. 1868, humanity discovers an element 93 million miles away. On Tuesday, the 18th of August, 1868, the French astronomer Pierre Janssen was in India observing a total solar eclipse when he pointed a spectroscope at the sun. Spectroscopy was still relatively new at that time, the technique of separating light into its component wavelengths and looking for the distinctive bright or dark lines produced by different chemical elements. Think of it sort of as a chemical barcode. You might not think that it predates color photography by so many years, but indeed it does. Janssen noticed a bright yellow line in the solar spectrum that did not correspond to any element that was then known to exist on Earth. Later that year, the British astronomer Norman Lockyer independently observed the same mysterious signature. The obvious conclusion was simultaneously brilliant and slightly ridiculous. There appeared to be an element in the sun that nobody had ever found on Earth. Lockyer and the chemist Edward Franklin gave it a name that they derived from Helios, the Greek personification of the sun. They called it helium. They initially assumed it was probably a metal, which helps to explain why its name received the metallic-sounding suffix of IUM. And then came the really wonderful part. For more than 20 years, scientists continued discussing an element whose existence had been established by looking at an object approximately 93 million miles away, while nobody could conclusively put any of it in a bottle here at home. It wasn't until 1895 that William Ramsay isolated terrestrial helium from a uranium-bearing mineral and demonstrated that its spectrum perfectly matched the solar mystery substance. So helium belongs to a very exclusive category in the history of science. Things that we discovered in outer space before we discovered them on Earth. Today, it's such a familiar thing that we associate it mainly with balloons, airships, cryogenics, and birthday parties. But its scientific debut came in the atmosphere of the sun during an eclipse, decades before anyone knew with certainty that there was any of it beneath their own feet. Astronomers had successfully analyzed the chemical composition of a star before chemists finished inventorying the planet that they were standing on. And if that isn't the 19th century showing off, I don't know what the hell is. August 19th, 43 BC. Octavian discovers that elections work better when you bring along 8 heavily armed legions of election observers. On Wednesday, the 19th of August, 43 BC, 19-year-old Gaius Octavius, better known to history as Octavian and eventually, of course, Augustus, became first consul of Rome. Elected is technically the correct word. There was, however, an unusually persuasive get-out-the-vote operation that was involved. Julius Caesar had been murdered the previous year, leaving his teenage great-nephew as his adopted son and principal heir. Octavian had rapidly acquired Caesar's name, Caesar's veterans, and the disconcerting habit of behaving as though being 19 were no obstacle to running the Roman world. Earlier in the year 43, he had cooperated with the Senate against Mark Antony. That alliance worked just long enough to defeat Antony at Mutina, whereupon both serving consuls conveniently died. The Senate tried to sideline Octavian, and Octavian discovered that he and the Senate had developed irreconcilable philosophical differences concerning exactly how important Octavian ought to be. So, he sent centurions to Rome demanding that he be awarded the vacant consulship. The Senate told him to fuck off. Octavian responded by crossing the Rubicon with 8 legions and marching on Rome. This produced an astonishing late surge of support for his candidacy. An October surprise with lots of swords, one might say. On August 19th, he and his relative Quintus Pedius were elected consuls, making Octavian the youngest consul that Rome had ever seen. He immediately secured legal confirmation of his adoption by Caesar and legislating prosecuting Caesar's assassins. Within a matter of months, he would reconcile with Antony and Lepidus, establish the Second Triumvirate, unleash the proscriptions, defeat Brutus and Cassius, eventually destroy Antony and Cleopatra, and become the unchallenged master of the Roman world. The best part is the way Augustus later described all of this in his own self-hagiography entitled Res Gestae. At 19, he wrote, he had raised an army on my own initiative and at my own expense in order to restore liberty to the Republic. And if restoring constitutional government requires marching 8 legions into the capital until everybody votes correctly, well, sometimes that's just the way the ball bounces. Rome was still, shall we say, working some of the bugs out of representative democracy. 1839, France releases photography into the wild. On Monday, the 19th of August, 1839, François Arago stood before a joint meeting of the French Academies of Sciences and Fine Arts in Paris and publicly revealed the process developed by Louis Daguerre for permanently fixing an image produced by a camera. The daguerreotype had thus arrived. Daguerre was not the first person to create a photograph. That honor properly belongs in large measure to his former partner, whose name I am not going to attempt to pronounce. But Daguerre had developed a practical process capable of producing extraordinarily detailed images on silver-plated copper. The French government then made an unusual arrangement. Rather than allowing Daguerre and his partner's heirs to keep the invention proprietary, France granted them lifetime pensions and placed the process into the public domain, which is why August 19th is now celebrated as World Photography Day. There is, of course, naturally, a footnote. The famous claim that France gave photography free to the world came with a bit of a fine print that read, "This offer not valid in England and Wales," because Daguerre's agent had obtained a British patent 5 days earlier. Apparently, even the gift of photography to humanity required regional licensing restrictions. Because of course it did. The early process was also, as you may know, spectacularly inconvenient. Exposure times could run for several minutes in bright sunlight and much longer under poor conditions, which initially made portrait photography less a matter of saying cheese than of clamping somebody's head into place and ordering them not to blink until further notice. But because the process was freely made available across most of the world, experimenters immediately started improving upon it. Within a few years, exposure times had collapsed, portrait studios proliferated, and ordinary people who could never afford to commission an oil painting could preserve an exact likeness of themselves and their families. Humanity had spent thousands of years possessing only paintings and descriptions of what people looked like. Then, suddenly, we could freeze reality directly onto a little plate, and having acquired that astonishing ability, it took approximately 11 minutes before somebody began complaining that they looked terrible in the picture. 1960. Belka and Strelka boldly go where no dog has come back from before. On Friday, the 19th of August, 1960, the Soviet Union launched Karabi Sputnik 2, usually called Sputnik 5 here in the West. Its most famous passengers were two dogs, Belka, meaning squirrel, and Strelka, meaning little arrow. I feel like it should have been moose and squirrel. I feel like the Soviets missed a huge trolling opportunity there, but maybe that's just me. They were not the only passengers on board, though, not by a long shot. They were accompanied by a rabbit, 40 mice, 2 rats, some fruit flies, some plants, and various other bits of biological stuff. The Soviet Union had already put a dog into orbit. Of course, Laika had flown aboard Sputnik 2 back in 1957. But Laika had never been intended to return. Belka and Strelka, on the other hand, were testing something much more important. Whether a living organism could survive a launch, spend an extended period in orbit, endure re-entry, and come home in a condition of not being dead, which, in the event, they did. After roughly a day in space, the capsule returned safely on August 20th, making its passengers the very first living creatures recovered alive after an orbital flight. And the Soviets were watching them on television while they flew. This produced one unexpectedly important medical observation. On the fourth orbit, Belka became agitated and promptly lost her lunch. Soviet flight physicians looked at that and concluded that perhaps the first human spaceflight should not be too excessively ambitious. So when Yuri Gagarin finally flew the following April, his mission consisted of exactly one orbit only. Belka's motion sickness may therefore have contributed to one of history's wiser examples of engineers resisting the temptation to say, while we're up there, let's see what happens if we do 17 more. Both dogs survived and became fairly big Soviet celebrities. Strelka later produced 6 puppies, one of whom, Pushinka, Nikita Khrushchev gave to the Kennedy family. Probably with a KGB listening device up its ass, but who can say for sure? So in the middle of the Cold War, while the United States and Soviet Union were constructing enough nuclear weapons to incinerate civilization several times over, they also found time for a bit of nice puppy diplomacy. And 8 months after Belka and Strelka returned safely, Gagarin followed them. The path to human spaceflight had been cleared by 2 dogs, 40 mice, 2 rats, a rabbit, and one strategically important episode of zero-gravity vomiting. August 20th, 636 AD, Yarmouk removes the Byzantine Empire from the Levant. On Thursday, the 20th of August, 636 AD, according to the conventional chronology, the 6-day Battle of Yarmouk reached its catastrophic denouement. If you've never heard of Yarmouk, that's alright, don't feel bad. It belongs to that peculiar category of battles that almost nobody outside specialist history circles can identify, despite the fact that the world after the battle looked fundamentally different than the world before it, forever. The contestants were the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire under Emperor Heraclius and the armies of the young Rashidun Caliphate, with Khalid ibn al-Walid playing the decisive military role on the Muslim side. The timing could scarcely have been any worse for Byzantium. For roughly a quarter century, the Romans and Sasanian Persians had been beating each other bloody in one of antiquity's most destructive wars. Heraclius had ultimately pulled off a remarkable victory and defeated the Persians. Then, almost immediately, armies united by the new religion of Islam came pouring out of Arabia toward the two exhausted superpowers. At Yarmouk, the Byzantines attempted to recover territory already lost in Syria. Instead, their field army was very decisively defeated. On the final day, Khalid used his concentrated cavalry to help break the Byzantine position. Retreat turned into disaster amid the ravines and broken ground around the Yarmouk. And the strategic consequences, well, they were enormous. The Byzantines never recovered Syria and Palestine. Damascus, Jerusalem, and the rest of the Levant passed permanently out of Roman control, and Muslim armies soon moved onward into Egypt. An imperial presence in Syria that had stretched back into the Roman conquest in the 1st century BC was effectively extinguished. Heraclius had spent his reign pulling off one of the greatest military comebacks in Roman history against the Persians, but then an opponent that had barely existed as a unified political force when his reign began appeared from Arabia and took away much of what he had just saved. Sometimes history doesn't merely close one door and open another. Sometimes it waits until you finished rebuilding the house and changes the locks. Then it kicks you in the balls and laughs at you while you're writhing on the ground. 1775, Tucson receives a Spanish fort, courtesy of a red-headed Irishman. On Sunday, the 20th of August, 1775, Lieutenant Colonel Hugo O'Connor, in the service of the King of Spain, selected and laid out the site of the new Presidio San Agustin del Tucson. Calling this the founding of Tucson, though, requires an immediate qualification. People had been living in the Tucson Basin for many thousands of years at that point, and indigenous communities already occupied the Santa Cruz Valley long before any Spaniards arrived. Even the name Tucson derives ultimately from the Odoham Kukon, generally understood as referring to the settlement at the base of the Black Hill, the hill in this case being today's Sentinel Peak, or A Mountain, if you're feeling far less imaginative. Hey, what should we call that peak over yonder? I don't know. A Mountain? Okay, smartass, you win. A Mountain it is. And what happened in 1775 was the establishment of the Spanish military post from which colonial and later urban Tucson developed. And the man responsible was not, as one might expect, named Garcia or Mendoza or Rodriguez. He was born Hugh O'Connor in Dublin, Ireland, a famously non-Spanish part of the world. Catholic Irishmen barred from advancement under British rule had a long tradition of entering military service with continental European powers, and O'Connor wound up in the Spanish army. Changed his name to Hugo O'Connor and eventually rose to the command on the northern frontier of New Spain. He was also a ginger, as the Irish sometimes have a tendency to be. The Apaches called him El Capitan Colorado, the Red Captain. O'Connor was reorganizing Spain's chain of frontier presidios when he ordered the garrison at Tubac move north to Tucson. The site offered water, pasture, timber, and helped defend the Spanish settlements and missions along the Santa Cruz corridor. The presidio was completed the following year and became one of Spain's northernmost military outposts. So before Tucson was American, it was Mexican. Before it was Mexican, it was Spanish. Before it was Spanish, people had already been living there for some millennia. And the Spanish chapter begins with a red-headed Irish Catholic officer named Hugh who changed his name to Hugo and rode around the Sonoran Desert fighting the Apaches. Having recently spent 4 days in Tucson myself, during which I bore witness to more random street crime than I've seen in the last 15 goddamn years here in San Diego, I will leave the modern field observations to more eminently qualified scholars. Did you ever have to slam on your brakes because the guy in the car in front of you decided he needed to suddenly pull over to the sidewalk and grab Toothless Trixie for a $5 special at 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning? Because I have. Exactly one time. In Tucson. I'm just saying. 1882, Tchaikovsky discovers the one thing every orchestra needs, artillery. On Sunday, the 20th of August, 1882, the official exhibition premiere of Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky, the year 1812, better known to history as the 1812 Overture, took place at Moscow's All-Russian Arts and Industrial Exhibition. I say official exhibition premiere because there had actually been at least 2 performances during the preceding month, but we won't talk about those. This is the sort of distinction which prevents metallurgical pedants, classical music pedants, and chronology pedants from all forming an alliance against us, and we don't want that. The piece had been commissioned 2 years earlier to commemorate Russia's defeat of Napoleon's invasion in 1812. Tchaikovsky was not inspired. In fact, he regarded the assignment with approximately the enthusiasm of a high school student being informed that the term paper is due on Monday. While composing it, he told his patron, Nebrija von Meck, that the overture would be very loud and noisy, that he had written it without warm or loving feelings, and that it would therefore probably lack artistic merit. Later, he called it a very mediocre work. The public then responded by making it one of the most famous things that he ever wrote. Apparently, Tchaikovsky had underestimated a principle that was later instinctively understood by AC/DC. People fucking love cannons. The overture tells the story of Napoleon's invasion musically, setting fragments of La Marseillaise against Russian themes before the French material is overwhelmed and the finale erupts into bells, orchestra, and actual goddamn artillery fire. The score specifies cannon fire, not metaphorical cannon fire, not percussionists approximating cannon fire, but actual freaking cannons, big ones, and lots of them. There is even some splendid historical cheating contained inside the music. Tchaikovsky ends with the Russian imperial anthem, God Save the Tsar, which has a wonderful effect, but unfortunately, that anthem wasn't actually composed until 1833, 21 years after the events supposedly being depicted. Tchaikovsky was making a patriotic spectacle, not submitting evidence to a historical commission. And on that question, his artistic instincts, it has to be said, were absolutely correct. Because nobody has ever reached the climax of the 1812 overture, heard bells ringing over a full orchestra while field guns start being fired off, and said, "Excellent. But I do have a bit of a concern about the anthem's chronology." Sometimes historical accuracy must yield to a higher artistic truth. And that truth, in this case, is, if your concert finale isn't working, add more cannons. And more cowbell, obviously. August 21st, 1810, Sweden hires one of Napoleon's marshals to become Swedish. On Tuesday, the 21st of August, 1810, the Swedish Parliament elected Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, Marshal of France and Prince of Pontecorvo, as Crown Prince of Sweden. And this, of course, requires a bit of explanation. Sweden had just endured a fairly catastrophic few years. King Gustav IV Adolf had been deposed in 1809 after a war with Russia cost Sweden the possession of Finland, which it had controlled in one form or another for some centuries. His successor, Charles XIII, was elderly and childless. The Swedes therefore needed an heir pretty badly, preferably one with enough military prestige to keep their suddenly diminished kingdom from being kicked around by Europe's larger powers. They first adopted a Danish prince named Charles August, and he promptly dropped dead. So, Sweden reopened the royal employment search. At this point, a young Swedish lieutenant named Karl Otto Morner did something that was wonderfully unauthorized. While in Paris, he approached Bernadotte and essentially asked him, "Hey bro, how would you like to be king of Sweden?" Nobody had authorized Morner to do any such thing or make any such offer. The Swedish government was sufficiently impressed with his initiative that when he returned home, they promptly placed him under arrest. Unfortunately for them, his ridiculous idea actually began catching on. Morner had effectively invented a political movement and then watched everybody decide that maybe this lunatic has some sort of a point here. Bernadotte was a highly successful soldier. He had a reputation in Sweden for humane treatment of Swedish prisoners during an earlier campaign, and crucially, he was neither Russian nor Danish. On August 21st, the Assembly Estates at Orebro chose him. He converted to Lutheranism, he was adopted by Charles XIII, he took the name Karl Johan, and he arrived in Sweden that autumn. And then, the story gets even better. When Napoleon's relationship with Sweden later deteriorated, his former marshal eventually joined the coalition against him. As commander of the Allied Army of the North, Bernadotte fought against Napoleon's forces during the 1813 campaign that culminated at Leipzig. He then forced Denmark to surrender Norway to Sweden. In 1818, the former French revolutionary soldier became King Charles XIV John of Sweden and Charles III John of Norway. His descendants, they are still there sitting on that throne. The current Swedish royal family remains the House of Bernadotte, more than 2 centuries after Sweden solved its succession crisis by allowing an overeager lieutenant to go to Paris and recruit a Frenchman. There are elaborate theories about dynastic legitimacy. Apparently, another perfectly workable method is just find a successful middle manager at Napoleon Incorporated and offer him Scandinavia. 1911. Somebody steals the Mona Lisa and accidentally makes it the most famous painting on Earth. On Monday, the 21st of August, 1911, former Louvre employee Vincenzo Perugia walked into the museum and stole Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. The Louvre was closed to the public on Monday, as you see, and Perugia knew the building. He had worked on the protective glass surrounding the artworks, and he could pass, plausibly, for one of the museum's workmen. So he just removed the painting from its frame and departed the building with a Renaissance masterpiece that was small enough to secrete underneath his clothing. And nobody noticed for more than a day. When an artist arrived to copy the painting and found an empty space on the wall, Louvre employees initially assumed it had merely been taken away to be photographed or something. Eventually, though, somebody actually checked. No, it turns out it hadn't been taken away. Well, it had been taken away, but it was taken away by a thief. They had lost the Mona freaking Lisa. France went insane, of course. The Louvre closed. Newspapers around the world covered the theft. Thousands of people eventually came to the museum merely to stare at the empty wall. Police pursued various theories and somehow managed to drag Guillaume Apollinaire and Pablo Picasso into the investigation because an acquaintance of theirs had previously stolen antiquities from the Louvre. They, of course, were innocent. Meanwhile, police actually interviewed Perugia at one point, but failed to notice that the painting was hidden inside the apartment he was in. For more than 2 years, he just kept the thing. Then in 1913, he contacted an art dealer in Florence and tried to return or sell it to Italy. Perugia later presented himself as an Italian patriot recovering art that Napoleon had stolen from his homeland. There was only one minor problem with that. Napoleon hadn't stolen the Mona Lisa. Leonardo himself had taken the painting to France centuries earlier, where it ultimately entered the French royal collection. It was an unusually poor choice of masterpiece for nationalist repatriation. Perugia was arrested, the painting was returned to Paris, and the enormous publicity surrounding the theft transformed an already highly esteemed Leonardo into something approaching a secular holy relic. The caper helped make the Mona Lisa the most recognizable painting on Earth. And the story is unusually topical on this week of all weeks. Italian authorities are right now investigating the theft of works by Antonello da Messina from the Regional Museum in Messina in a brazen operation so peculiar that officials are examining possible organized crime involvement. Apparently, after a century of alarms, cameras, motion detectors, and specialized art crime police, humanity has yet to develop a security system capable of completely defeating the sophisticated criminal technique known as walking into a museum and leaving with the art. 1945, the Demon Corps claims its first victim. On Tuesday, the 21st of August, 1945, 24-year-old physicist Harry Dalian was working at the Omega site at Los Alamos. The war had ended only days earlier. Dalian had worked on the Manhattan Project and had been present at the Trinity tests. Now he was conducting criticality experiments using a spherical plutonium core. The experiment consisted of stacking tungsten carbide bricks around the plutonium, creating a neutron reflector, and determining how close the assembly could be pushed toward criticality. This is exactly as relaxing as it sounds. Dalian was working alone, which was very much contrary to the safety rules. As he moved another brick into position, his neutron counter warned him that placing it there was going to drive the assembly critical. Dalian attempted to pull the brick away. Instead, he dropped the damn thing, and the core went prompt critical. Dalian desperately knocked away and removed bricks until he had stopped the reaction, but in the act of doing so, exposed himself to a massive dose of radiation. He died 25 days later on September the 15th, and as you can imagine, those were a uniquely miserable 25 days. Los Alamos responded by tightening its procedures. Henceforth, criticality experiments were absolutely not to be performed alone under any circumstances. Remote control equipment was discussed and designed so that human beings would no longer have to manipulate dangerously near critical plutonium assemblies by hand. Great. Excellent. Problem solved, right? Except the remote equipment wasn't quite ready yet. And so 9 months later, the physicist Louis Slotin used the very same plutonium core in another hand-operated criticality demonstration. His experiment involved lowering one beryllium hemisphere over another around the plutonium while preventing them from closing completely. And the sophisticated piece of precision nuclear engineering equipment that Slotin used to maintain the separation was, wait for it, a common head screwdriver. I'll just prop the neutron reflector up with this, and it'll be fine, right? Well, the screwdriver slipped, and the hemispheres closed. The core, it went critical again. Slotin immediately pulled the assembly apart with his bare hands, saving the other people in the room from much worse exposure, but receiving a lethal dose himself. He died 9 days later. After 2 fatal accidents, the plutonium sphere acquired the nickname by which history remembers it, the Demon Core. And the lesson here is not that these men were stupid. Far from it. They weren't anything resembling stupid. They were some of the finest physicists on the face of the earth. The lesson is considerably more alarming. Namely, that being one of the smartest people alive apparently does not provide immunity against doing something catastrophically stupid with a screwdriver. August 22nd, 1642, Charles I raises the royal standard and Britain's family argument becomes a civil war. On Friday, the 22nd of August, 1642, King Charles I raised his royal standard at Nottingham. By this point, Charles and Parliament had been drifting toward armed conflict for some months. There had been the King's 11-year personal rule without Parliament. There had been fights over taxation and religion. There had been rebellion in Scotland, the recall of Parliament, the execution of Charles's minister, the Earl of Strafford, and finally Charles's magnificently unsuccessful attempt to enter the House of Commons and personally arrest 5 members of Parliament. Of course, the 5 dudes he wanted to arrest had already left. Astonishingly, walking into the legislature with armed men and asking where your political opponents have gone does not ordinarily improve constitutional relations. And who knew? Charles left London soon after that. Through the summer of 1642, King and Parliament raised forces while continuing to insist that the other side was responsible for all this shit. Then, at Nottingham on 22 August, Charles formally raised the royal standard and summoned loyal subjects to his army. Conventionally, this marks the beginning of the First English Civil War. The ceremony, though, was not particularly encouraging. The weather was miserable, as the English weather often is. Recruitment around Nottingham proved less enthusiastic than Charles had hoped, and in what royalist public relations really could have done without, the royal standard was soon blown down by the wind. Contemporaries unsurprisingly interpreted this event as a bad omen, and they were not wrong. 4 months later, nobody had won. 4 years later, Charles had lost the First Civil War. He then escaped custody, helped to provoke another round of fighting, lost that one too, and eventually supplied Parliament's increasingly radical soldiers with the revolutionary suggestion, what if England simply didn't have a king anymore? In January 1649, Charles was tried for treason against his own subjects and beheaded outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. Britain abolished the monarchy for 11 years. And then everybody, they decided they had had just about enough of that, and they invited Charles's son back. They then immediately realized what a profligate, hedonistic, spendthrift scumbag that guy was, and immediately began laying the groundwork for replacing the House of Stuart with an altogether different royal house, which tells you kind of a lot about the love-hate relationship that Britain has with its monarchy. So the English Civil War ultimately demonstrated 2 rather important constitutional principles. The first is that the king cannot simply rule without Parliament. And the second, England can apparently survive approximately 11 years without a king before becoming quite uncomfortable and ordering another one. 1851, America wins the America's Cup before there is an America's Cup. On the 22nd of August, 1851, during the summer of London's Great Exhibition, a revolutionary-looking American schooner named, in a real flight of imaginary fancy, America, lined up against the finest yachts that Britain could offer in a race around the Isle of Wight. The boat belonged to a syndicate headed by the New York Yacht Club Commodore John Cox Stevens, no relation to John Stevens Cox or to Dewey Cox, despite rumors to the contrary. The Americans had crossed the Atlantic partly to demonstrate American yacht design and partly because wealthy Victorian gentlemen regarded gambling enormous sums of money on boat races as a perfectly respectable use of an afternoon. The Royal Yacht Squadron arranged a race for its 100-pound cup, pounds in this case referring to money, not the weight of the trophy, which would be open to international competition. 15 yachts started the race, 14 of them were British. The other one was our little friend America. The Americans, quite improbably, won the damn thing. And this produced one of the most famous exchanges in all of sporting history. According to the traditional story, Queen Victoria was watching the race and asked, "Which is first?" "America, Your Majesty," someone replied. "And which is second?" The reply to that question was, "Your Majesty, there is no second." It is a magnificent line, of course. It's also one of those magnificent lines whose documentary pedigree becomes less impressive the harder historians stare at it. The America's Cup organization itself appropriately describes the exchange as something that was supposedly said, which is to say, it's almost certainly apocryphal, but we don't really care. We have retained it because historical accuracy has never defeated a really good quotation. The trophy returned to New York with the winning syndicate. 6 years later, they donated it to the New York Yacht Club under a deed of gift, establishing it as a perpetual international challenge trophy, and the cup eventually took its name from the winning boat, not the country, mind you. That is why it is called the America's Cup and not the American Cup. It's now generally regarded as the oldest trophy in all of international sport. And because history enjoys details that are designed specifically to irritate the pedantically inclined, the trophy everybody calls the America's Cup is really a silver ewer open at both ends and originally incapable of holding any drink whatsoever. So the oldest international sporting cup in existence isn't really a cup, but we don't care. 1963, Joe Walker flies an airplane into space. On Thursday, the 22nd of August, 1963, NASA research pilot Joseph A. Walker climbed into a North American X-15 number 3 beneath the wing of a B-52. The B-52 carries him to altitude and releases him. Walker lights the X-15's rocket engine, and then he went up. And up. Not airline up, not U-2 up, not SR-71 up. I'm talking space up. Walker eventually reaches 354,200 feet, 67.1 miles above the surface of the Earth. That placed him well above not only the military's 50-mile definition of space, but the 100-kilometer Kármán line, recognized internationally as the conventional boundary of outer space. It was the highest flight ever made by an X-15, and Walker had already crossed the Kármán line the previous month. So while Yuri Gagarin and the Mercury astronauts received the glory in the popular memory, Joe Walker quietly became the first human being to go into space more than once. And he did it in something with wings that took off under another airplane and landed on a dry lake bed. The entire flight only lasted about 11 minutes. The powered portion lasted far less than that. After the rocket engine shut down, Walker coasted upward ballistically, used reaction controls when conventional aerodynamic surfaces became ineffective in the near vacuum, then fell back into the atmosphere and transitioned from spacecraft to extremely freaking fast glider. There was no second chance at the landing. Obviously, the X-15 carried no conventional landing gear in the rear, only a pair of skids, and once the engine burned out, there was no restarting it. In other words, pick your lake bed very carefully. Walker's 354,200-foot record for piloted aircraft stood until Spaceship One finally exceeded it in 2004, more than 40 years later. And the X-15 wasn't merely an exercise in setting records. Its flights generated enormous amounts of data on hypersonic heating, stability, controls, structures, and atmospheric re-entry. Precisely the problems American engineers had to understand as human spaceflight was developing. Walker himself moved on to the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle program, helping develop the bizarre flying contraptions that Apollo astronauts later used to practice landing on the moon. Sadly, though, he never lived to see Apollo 11. In 1966, Walker was killed when the F-104 he was flying collided with the giant XB-70 Valkyrie during a formation photo flight, an incident so tragic and so shambolic, It probably warrants its own deep dive video, but for one afternoon in August of 1963, Joe Walker sat in an aircraft, was dropped from another aircraft, lit a rocket beside it behind himself, and flew so high that he ran out of atmosphere before he ran out of airplane. August 23rd, 1784, the United States almost gets a state of Franklin. On Monday, the 23rd of August, 1784, delegates from 3 counties in the western reaches of North Carolina gathered at Jonesboro and unanimously declared themselves independent of the state. They were not, however, attempting to leave the United States. In fact, quite the opposite. They just wanted to become another one of them, was all. At the end of the Revolution, North Carolina stretched all the way across the mountains into what is now present-day Tennessee. The settlements on the far side of the Appalachians were very remote from the state government. They were exposed to frontier warfare, and they were increasingly populated by people who thought that Raleigh was collecting considerably more loyalty than it was providing government. Then North Carolina offered its western lands to Congress to help satisfy the national debt. The inhabitants understandably wondered whether they were about to become politically homeless. So, on August 23rd and 24th, delegates from Washington, Sullivan, and Greene counties met at Jonesboro and duly declared their independence. The resulting polity eventually adopted the name of Franklin. They elected Revolutionary War veteran John Sevier to be their governor. They established courts and a legislature, collected taxes, and behaved in most respects just like a proper state. There was only one trifling administrative problem. Nobody had admitted them to the Union. Franklin sent a delegation to Congress in 1785. 7 states even supported their cause. However, under the Articles of Confederation, they needed the support of 9. So Franklin achieved the unusual constitutional status of having fallen 2 votes short of actually existing. Meanwhile, North Carolina reconsidered its original land cession and decided they wanted that territory back. For a while, parts of present-day eastern Tennessee therefore enjoyed 2 competing governments simultaneously, Franklin officials and North Carolina officials issuing commissions, operating courts, and attempting to govern the same population. This eventually escalated into armed confrontation between the supporters of Sevier and the supporters of North Carolina loyalist John Tipton. But Franklin collapsed in 1788. Sevier was arrested for treason, although he was never tried, and North Carolina subsequently ceded the Western Territory again, this time successfully, to the federal government. In 1796, most of the same territory finally entered the Union properly as the state we lovingly know today as Tennessee, with our friend John Sevier as its first governor. So, Tennessee statehood ultimately worked out. It merely required 12 years, 2 governments, an attempted 14th state, an arrest for treason, and apparently filling out the federal paperwork correctly the second time. 1944. A 22-year-old king fires his dictator and changes sides in the middle of a world war. On Wednesday, the 23rd of August, 1944, King Michael I of Romania summoned Marshal Ion Antonescu to the royal palace in Bucharest. Michael was 22 years old. Antonescu was Romania's military dictator, Hitler's ally, and effectively the man who had been running the country, while the young king largely served as a figurehead. But by August of 1944, the arrangement had developed what management consultants might describe as a fairly serious strategic problem. Namely, the Germans were losing. Romania had entered the war against the Soviet Union in 1941, supplying troops and, crucially, oil from the fields around Ploiești. Hundreds of thousands of Romanians had become casualties on the Eastern Front, and on August 20th, the Soviets had launched the enormous Jassy-Kishinev offensive. The Axis position in Romania was collapsing with astonishing speed. Michael and the leaders of Romania's principal opposition parties had already been preparing to get the country out of the war. And on the afternoon of August 23rd, Antonescu came to the palace. The king demanded that he accept an immediate armistice with the Allies. But Antonescu would not do so without first obtaining Hitler's agreement. Michael withdrew briefly, then he returned, and he informed Antonescu that he was now dismissed, and then had him arrested inside the royal palace, which must rank fairly high among history's awkward meetings with upper management, one has to say. Michael installed General Constantine Sanitescu as the new prime minister that evening, the king addressed the country by radio, announcing the break with Antonescu's dictatorship and Romania's acceptance of the Allied armistice terms. The new government ordered Romanian forces to cease fighting the Red Army and asked German forces to politely leave the country. The Germans, though, they declined the invitation. Instead, German aircraft bombed Bucharest and fighting erupted between Romanian and German forces. On August 25th, Romania formally declared war on Germany, and the consequences of that were fairly immense. Germany abruptly lost an ally, and they lost vital access to Romanian oil and much of its strategic position in southeastern Europe. Romanian forces now fought westward alongside the Soviets through Hungary and into Czechoslovakia. An entire flank of Hitler's European empire had effectively fallen open, and all of it began when the 22-year-old ceremonial monarch everybody had assumed could be safely ignored actually decided, no, I think I'm the king, and I'm going to act like it. There is, unfortunately, a very Romanian postscript to all this. Michael's action helped shorten his country's war against the Allies, but it could not prevent Soviet domination afterward. In December 1947, Romania's communist government forced him to abdicate, and abolished the monarchy. So, King Michael helped remove a pro-German dictatorship in 1944, only to discover 3 years later that when the Red Army arrives as your new ally, getting it to go home is considerably more complicated than a palace coup. 1954, the C-130 Hercules takes off and apparently decides never to go out of production. And finally, on Monday, the 23rd of August, 1954, 72 years ago today, in fact, Lockheed test pilots Stanley Belts and Roy Wimmer climbed aboard a decidedly unglamorous-looking new military transport aircraft at Burbank, California. It was the second of two YC-130 prototypes. The Air Force had asked for a rugged medium transport capable of hauling troops and bulky equipment over substantial distances while operating from the short, primitive airstrips the Korean War had demonstrated were an unavoidable part of military aviation. Lockheed's answer had 4 Allison turboprops, a high wing, a cavernous cargo compartment, and a loading ramp at the rear. On its first flight, the YC-130 needed only about 800 feet of runway in order to get airborne. It then flew for 61 minutes from Burbank to Edwards Air Force Base. It did not look futuristic, did not break the sound barrier. Nobody intended it to dogfight MiGs or look particularly good. It was designed to carry a great deal of stuff into places where large airplanes didn't have any business landing. Lockheed had apparently stumbled, though, upon immortality. The production C-130 Hercules entered service in 1956 and has been turned into almost every conceivable variety of airplane. It's been a transport. It's been a tanker. It's been a gunship. It's been an electronic warfare platform. It's been a search and rescue aircraft. It's been a weather reconnaissance aircraft. It's been a firebomber, a special operations aircraft, an Antarctic ski plane, for God's sake, a satellite catcher. It has dropped paratroopers and humanitarian aid, flown from dirt and from ice, and even demonstrated that a Hercules could land and take off from an aircraft carrier without a catapult or arresting wires. Whenever somebody invents a new mission, somewhere there is apparently an Air Force officer saying, "Could we put it in a C-130? And here is the extraordinary part. The airplane that first flew while Dwight Eisenhower was president, 1 year after Stalin died and a month after Elvis Presley recorded his first single, that thing is still in production in the year 2026. I'm not talking about restored examples or remanufactured antiques. Brand new C-130Js are still coming off the Lockheed Martin line at Marietta, Georgia. More than 2,700 Hercules aircraft have been ordered or delivered, and the C-130 production line holds the record as the longest continuously operating military aircraft production line in world history. The basic airplane has obviously evolved rather enormously. Modern C-130Js have different engines, propellers, avionics, and systems from the early Hercules, but put that 1954 prototype beside a C-130J rolling out of Marietta today, and there is absolutely no mistaking the family resemblance. Which suggests that Lockheed's engineers committed one of the great professional errors in the history of planned obsolescence. That is, they got the design right the first time. 72 years ago today, the first Hercules lifted off a runway in Burbank, And after wars in Korea, Vietnam, the Persian Gulf, Afghanistan, Iraq, after the jet age, the space age, the moon landings, and the invention of the freaking iPhone, they are still building the damn thing. So after a week that began with Robert Fulton discovering that transportation works better when you don't have to wait for the wind, I can think of no more appropriate place than this to finish, and that is the C-130 is still flying, and so, mercifully, are we. But we are running a bit low on gas, so if anybody knows of a dry lake bed nearby. And with that, we close the book on this installment of This Week in History. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, as ever, for your kind attention. And I now transmit you into the custody of my distinguished colleague, your illustrious co-host, the one and only, your friend and mine, Mr. Caucasian Sasquatch.